Hey everyone, hope you're having a good day. My name's Andy. My channel is Finding Value. Today we're going to go and look at different ETFs versus each other in a ratio format. I do this all the time just to see what sectors are outperforming other sectors. What does the best sector look like? Um, are there any that are breaking any sort of patterns or some basing patterns that are starting to come on up? And it gives us an indication of what sector could outperform the others. And I just kind of scrolled through them real quick just to see before, talking about it. And there are some changes going on between the ETFs. So let's dive in here. Let's take a look and see what's going on with the relative performance against these other sectors. And so I'm just comparing commodity versus commodity. So sectors like the uranium ETF versus gold and silver mining companies versus XOP, which is our oil and gas exploration companies, rare earth metals, agriculture. It's the ag business ETF. I'm just comparing them all to see what looks the best. This does drive where money flows, my money flows that I make, where it goes to investments. It also pairs down sectors that I want to look at, and then I go into individual companies and start buying up the individual companies. So let's take a look. I'll give you my financial opinions. And if you need any help with anything, check out finding-value.com. We do still have that turkey coupon code going on. You might get a couple more days out of it. And if you're interested in looking in individual companies or how I'm positioned for this commodity bull market, you can see how I'm doing it. Not that I have the end-all be-all portfolio of everyone, but it is doing quite well. So let's dive in and see what's going on in the market. So here is URNM versus XLE. So this is the uranium ETF versus the larger oil and gas companies. And you can see a vast outperformance of URNM coming on up here. It still looks good to continue higher if it wants to go higher in the future here. We still got some room to go up to a level that's almost slightly higher than where we are today. I'll just say that. URNM versus XOP. XOP is the oil and gas exploration ETF. I think it's more heavily loaded in natural gas. You can see a basing pattern here, a breakout, a retest, and we've been running on up. That could continue to the upside. There could still be some more left in it. But obviously, it's not as cheap as it was when it was down here in 2020. This is really the big appreciation move. Then you want to swap to XOP and ride XOP down to here. That would have been one heck of a ride to buy URNM at the bottom of 2020 here, ride it up, and then buy XOP and ride it back down. And that would have been just major purchasing power gains in the portfolio. URNM versus the CRB index. We are ripping to the upside, and it still looks good to continue higher. It looks good, and this could be a Livermore accumulation cylinder that I have written here and that we've broken just recently. So URNM was a really good spot to be looking at this spot right in there for potential buy points. URNM versus OIH. We had a squeeze up of the pattern. We had the dead period. Little move up, one last retest, and then we are moving to the upside where URNM's been outperforming the oil and gas or energy service companies. So that's looking good. We do have some resistance coming across here that we're going to have to play with here shortly. URNM versus REMX, massive squeeze in this thing. Look at this thing squeeze up, and then boom, boom. Big move for URNM versus REMX. And that is REMX also going lower while URNM was going higher. But, all things aren't going to last forever. But at the moment, momentum's still to the upside. URNM versus COPX. And what I see here is a potential turning point. We have a pretty big bearish engulfing here where we could come back lower. We're also at a cheap area for copper. So COPX could be a better short-term investment in the short term here, looking at the ratio chart. URNM versus SPX, that has broken to the upside, and that still looks good to go higher. This is a flag pattern or a pennant formation, something on the lines of that, but that still looks good to go higher for URNM. XOP versus REMX, coming back on out. So it's better to buy REMX at these spots over here. It looks like we could still go higher for maybe the short term. Maybe it's got a little bit left in it. Let's go to the daily here. Ooh, the dailies. Daily looks like this could fall. This is a bearish engulfing here. So let me throw some. We were still in the flag pattern though. And we'll see if we fall out of this flag pattern to the downside. But short term, we could fall a little bit, but we're in a flag pattern at the moment. And that's still bullish for a potential move to the upside. But I do think that this is getting, it's going to slow down as this valuation is starting to favor rare earth metals at this moment. XOP versus MU. XOP looks good versus MU, and it looks like we'll continue up. This would have been one heck of a buying opportunity for MU right here. MU there and XOP here. And that's exactly where I bought my oil and gas companies. So that looks good still for XOP. XOP versus OIH, I would say that this favors OIH. We've broken the uptrend line here. We've done a return move, and this looks like we have potential to go lower where the energy service companies could outperform XOP. We've got XOP versus GDX, and we're right at resistance support. This is this resistance support level. It's a pretty strong resistance support. It's basically in the middle of the ratio. We were at a very low ratio here. This is a perfect time to be buying XOP. XOP was cheap against everything. We've come on up, kind of almost doing like a double top, and we'll see if this thing actually heads lower, where GDX could outperform XOP. And it looks like the momentum is definitely in favor of that occurring in the short term. XOP versus crude oil still looks good for XOP to outperform crude oil. That still looks good. We've got XOP versus copper. And again, this was a really good time to be buying XOP because XOP was cheap against everything in October of 2020. That's where I purchased a bunch. But right now, it is heading a little bit back to the downside versus copper in the short term. You can see the momentum's to the downside in the short term. OIH versus MU. It still looks favorable for OIH, and it's still very cheap for OIH, which is the energy service companies. OIH versus REMX. It is still favorable for OIH. When I first started the website, we were buying a bunch of energy service companies down here in this general location right there. And we've got good outperformance against a lot of different sectors. Short term, a little bit of selling pressure there in the very short term, but it still looks good to go higher. Still looks good to go higher in kind of the longer term. And these are just kind of flag patterns that we've got going on. They're angled downward. Little flag patterns. GDX versus gold, it looks really good for GDX. GDX, and we're at a very cheap price point for GDX. So that's looking good, and it's got some good momentum, and hopefully we can start to break out of these little resistance areas. GDX versus REMX. GDX is ripping to the upside, and it looks like we are going to continue to the upside, maybe even way up here for a possibility of GDX outperformance. GDX versus SILJ. I think SILJ is incredibly cheap here. So GDX has looked good against everything we've looked at, and SILJ is cheap compared to GDX, and it is falling. I think that trend will continue, and SILJ is the one to look at. GDX versus URNM. It's favorable momentum-wise for URNM, but we're at a very cheap GDX ratio. We zoom in and let's go to the dailies here. It doesn't look bad on the dailies for GDX. We can throw a line across here. We haven't broken that yet, but I think it will break it. And I think we could see an outperformance of GDX here soon at some point. GDX versus XOP, it is definitely favorable for GDX. Here's your basing pattern here. We broke out way up there, came on back to do the return move, and this looks good to go back on higher as see that retest. If we go into the short term, you can see the green candlesticks, the momentum's going to the upside. So I favor GDX over XOP right now. GDX versus copper, the copper ETF, we are very cheap for GDX. And we'll see if we can get some momentum here to the upside where GDX will start to outperform the copper ETF. And then GDX versus OIH, this is definitely in favor of GDX. This is your basing pattern here, your breakout, and this is your return move where I think this is going to go higher again. So it's favorable for GDX at this time. Short-term momentum's to the upside. Looks good. SILJ versus silver, still incredibly cheap. This is a very good opportunity in SILJ versus silver, and I think this is a double bottom, guys. This is a really, 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 really good opportunity. SILJ versus OIH, it looks good for SILJ. It is cheap. It's got a support right where we're at, and the momentum is starting to come back up, so I think that looks fantastic. SILJ versus XOP, oh man, this looks really good for SILJ. Very, very cheap. This almost looks like an accumulation cylinder here. And this is ungodly cheap where it's at. SILJ versus URNM, it is cheap for SILJ, and it's starting to get some buying pressure here. It looks really good for SILJ. SILJ versus REMX, and SILJ is cheap. You've got kind of this basing pattern breakout, basing pattern breakout, basing pattern breakout. So SILJ definitely looks very good here. We've got SILJ versus COPX. That's broken the downtrend at a very cheap level. I think SILJ is looking excellent, and the momentum's to the upside. SILJ versus TAN, another one that still looks good, and it's cheap for SILJ at this current time. COPX versus OIH, one of the last standing ones. What I see here is a base, a breakout, and then we're coming on back a little bit here. And let me see. Let me throw a trend. There's no real trend line that's being broken here, but maybe it's forming some sort of pattern here or something like that. And then COPX versus GDX, and this is favorable for GDX. What I see here is kind of a pattern that looks like that, and it looks like it wants to break to the downside, and we're at a very cheap level in relationship. GDX is cheap in relationship to copper. So it would have always been beneficial to buy GDX at these areas there and then ride it on lower. Buy copper in these sections down here. So it is undeniable by looking at this stuff that SILJ looks to be the best. That's what it looks like to me. And that is where I would be looking for opportunities. That's basically it. So that's what I've got for today, guys. Give me a thumb up, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to the website, and we'll catch you guys later. This is Finding Value.